Kia ora anō. We are starting off this session it's a pre-record that you can watch in your own time, and it's going to have a focus on the connections between politics and trade. It's been argued that with the creation of the WTO in 1995, trade issues stopped being solely technical and became highly political, in part because of the exponential growth in world trade, but also because trade liberalization became about much more than abandoning customs and tariff protections, and much more about comparative advantages in areas like services and agriculture. Alongside this, the number and diversity of the economies engaging in global trade diversified immensely. No longer was this an environment dominated by the Euro-American duopoly. China's entry into the WTO amplified these shifts, and over time, we have witnessed a continued interest in the geopolitical landscape and its co-constitutive effects on the economics of trade. So to discuss this topic, and no doubt much more, we have four distinguished scholars whose expertise in politics and trade span our regions of interest right now. You can find their full bios in the handbook, but for now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Maureen Benson-Ray from the University of Auckland, Dr. Stephen Noakes from Professor Robert Patman from the University of Otago, Dr. Stephen Noakes from the University of Auckland, and Professor Stephen Ratuva from the University of Canterbury. So each speaker is going to have around 8 to 9 minutes, and then there'll be some questions from amongst ourselves for the remaining time. So Maureen, over to you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Maureen Benson-Ray, aho, and it's my pleasure to make some comments on the geopolitical context with a focus on the European Union. So I'll touch on some examples of how the advent and persistence of COVID-19 is creating new conversations on international trade, the connections between trade and health, digital trade regulations, and advancing a green trading system. So there are three main aspects I would like to build my remarks around. And these are three processes that have formed the European Union. So integration and its relation differentiation, deepening and widening. And do bear in mind that the European context is a multi-layered one with those twin goals of economic and political advancement. So in terms of integration, the EU's development has always been a case of 2 steps forward in integration, followed by 1 step back as the member states retreat into their national ways of doing things. The concatenation of Brexit and COVID-19 has been no exception and has severely challenged the EU project. However, the Commission, as the engine of EU integration, has brought forward some new collective initiatives. The COVID-19 pandemic resurrected national security as a justification for protectionism and industrial policy, especially in the critical sectors of food and health-related goods and services. In the case of PPE, for example, the EU Commission first restricted their export, then invited member states to be vigilant against foreign acquisitions of PPE manufacturing, and finally launched a consultation in June 2020 to develop a new strategic autonomy that combined a commitment to free and fair trade and the need to produce essential goods within the EU. So the European Union was not immune from the inward-looking policies of many governments globally, which firms are also pursuing through reshoring of value creation to home countries and a retreat to less globalized value chains. This trend of deglobalization has raised concerns about the escalation of autarkic plans, which could jeopardize the cross-border cooperation required to fix international problems. There's no getting away from the issues that divide the EU internally. Domestic political agendas have always been balanced on a knife edge, along with European-level commitments and initiatives. We now see a brand of ultra-right-wing conservatism in several Central and Eastern European member states. Could these find their way onto the trade agenda? Economic convergence and the operation of economic and monetary union, the Stability and Growth Pact, have been called a joke because the previous solidarity among member states remains under pressure from migration and the fallout from austerity after the GFC and the impact of Brexit, and not just on the UK. I see a slowdown of the deepening of EU integration, but perhaps, interestingly, a shift to deepening integration for external engagement rather than internal cohesion. And trade and sustainable development and the recent announcement of the Global Gateway are parts of this process. The EU's digital trade agenda continues the trajectory of the EU Single Market Programme to remove internal restrictions and thus enable internal competitiveness. And we should note the importance of fintech for the European economy there. We should also mention broader EU efforts to facilitate the widest and fastest production and equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines that the world so urgently needs. The EU is the biggest global provider of COVID-19 vaccines, with over 1.3 billion doses exported so far, more than half of its production. The Global Gateway is the EU's new 300 billion euro alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which shows the EU acting together in an investment program the EU claims will create links, not dependencies. The EU is explicitly calling this a true alternative to China's infrastructure program, with Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, emphasizing transparency and good governance. The EU alternative to the Belt and Road will be financed by a mix of 18 billion euros in grants, 280 billion euros in investment from member states, their development banks, the private sector, EU financing bodies, including the European Investment Bank. So it really is a collective initiative. The European Green Deal is another initiative linking trade and sustainable development with potential huge external impact. It aims to make Europe the first climate neutral continent in the world, going towards carbon neutrality by 2050. It is a most ambitious program that goes into many aspects of EU society, the economy, and trade. And the EU's new climate law of 2020 addresses the twin transitions of decarbonization, and digitization. Turning to widening, that's the process of building in more members. The EU has recently stated that it is not complete without the Western Balkans in building a stronger Europe. Some Western Balkan states have accession negotiations open, Albania, Serbia, Montenegro, etc., while others are waiting in the wings. These days, however, the idea of enlargement garners little enthusiasm in the European Union, and that's been one of the main drivers of integration. So it's a matter of internal consolidation, not expansion. As it worries about the fate of the Eurozone, tries to move forward with the European Green Deal and battles COVID-19, little surprise there is no time or energy for new members. However, Turkey, with its accession negotiations open since 2005, is a key partner for the EU in such essential areas as migration, countertourism, economy, trade, energy, and transport. And dialogue and cooperation with Turkey increased during 2021. The final aspect to this widening is the European Neighbourhood Policy, which governs its relations with 16 of its closest eastern and southern neighbours. So to conclude, there are tensions among these processes for the European Union. Some larger member states, such as France, see the generous recovery plan adopted last year to combat the pandemic-caused economic downturn as a stepping stone towards increased strategic autonomy and a higher degree of European sovereignty. The EU, the argument goes, needs to strengthen its institutions and deepen integration between members if it wishes to thrive in a growingly competitive world dominated by the US and China. Adding new countries to the fold complicates such plans. I would say that the EU is creating a sustainable and inclusive approach to participation in and complete commitment to the international trade rules. Its approach to internal and external trade dynamics is focusing on the connections quite specifically between trade and health. The EU has a clear strategic commitment well underway to digital trade regulations and advancing a greener trading system, which it clearly links to social issues as well as environmental issues. Nonetheless, there are huge opportunities in and with the EU for New Zealand businesses, for trade and investment. And I'd particularly call out the opportunities for knowledge exchange and further development of knowledge. I'll leave it there for the moment, but would like to thank Professor Jennifer Curtin, the Public Policy Institute, and MFAT for the invitation to participate today. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thanks so much, Maureen. And we know that you're going to have to leave us in advance of our discussion at the end. But if any questions come up throughout the conference, I know you'll be around and have the opportunity to talk with people in the meeting hub and so on. All right, thanks again. So it gives me great pleasure now to hand the microphone to Professor Robert Patman.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Jennifer. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm going to speak for the next 8 minutes on the Biden administration, the Indo-Pacific and New Zealand. While it be premature to provide a definitive assessment of the Biden administration's policy towards the Indo-Pacific, early trends, i.e. over the last 11 months, suggest that the region will assume much more foreign policy significance than it did under either the leadership of Barack Obama or Donald Trump. In an address at the US State Department on the 4th of February of this year, President Biden promised a clear break with Trump's America First policy and emphasized multilateralism and the revitalization of America's alliances in the Indo-Pacific region. According to Biden, diplomacy, quote, is back at the center of our foreign policy, unquote, and that means, in Biden's words, standing shoulder to shoulder with our allies and key partners once again. He referenced this comment about alliances and the importance to rebuild them in the context of China, which he described as America's most serious competitor. In office, during the last 11 months, the Biden administration has been quick to elevate the diplomatic importance of the Quad in March 2021 by hosting the first ever top-level meeting online. At the same time, there are indications that both the Biden administration and the Ardern government are keen to deepen bilateral cooperation around issues like COVID-19, climate change, and the Pacific. In late November 2021, a US naval vessel docked in New Zealand waters for the first time for 5 years. Nevertheless, there does seem to be some distance, perhaps inevitably, between the declaratory stance of the new Biden administration and the substantive policy that it's following in the Indo-Pacific. 11 months into the Biden administration, it's becoming apparent the new administration still doesn't have a developed trade policy of its own. Former President Donald Trump's import tariffs on Chinese goods remain in place, as does Trump's phase one trade deal with China outside of the established global trade rules. The dispute settlement system at the WTO, which of course is crucial for New Zealand's national interest, is that mechanism is still unable to enforce its rules due to the fact the United States is blocking the appointment of the appellate body judges. And there is little indication that the United States is going to reverse itself over its refusal, or rather its reluctance, to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. New Zealand and many other states have been caught somewhat off balance by the announcement in mid-September of this year concerning a new strategic alliance between Australia, the UK, and the United States, known by the acronym AUKUS. The AUKUS Pact envisages the sharing of information in key technological areas, including artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, to uphold what they call, the three members call, the international rules-based order. And they want to uphold the international rules-based order, apparently against the threat of growing Chinese assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific. As a first major initiative under the AUKUS banner, the United States and the UK have pledged to support Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines for its navy. New Zealand's omission from AUKUS has fueled a narrative in this country that New Zealand's independent foreign policy, and in particular its non-nuclear stance, has been somewhat sidelined by this development. But is this true? Has New Zealand been sidelined by the development of AUKUS? The basic problem facing AUKUS is that it is based on a binary assumption that the fate of the Indo-Pacific rests on US-China great power rivalry, and in particular on the capacity of America and its two closest allies to counterbalance Chinese assertiveness in the region. But while states like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam remain deeply concerned about Chinese activities in the Indo-Pacific, it does not mean they see AUKUS, an enhanced security arrangement involving three English-speaking states, two of whom have difficult historical links with the region, as the answer to the problem of Chinese assertiveness. Moreover, members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, such as Indonesia and Malaysia, have publicly condemned the prospect of Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, while Singapore, a close ally of Australia and this country, New Zealand, have also expressed concerns about this development. Sensitivities on nuclear proliferation in the Indo-Pacific are very real. In 1995, ASEAN member states signed the Treaty of Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapons Free Zone, which was intended to keep nuclear weapons out of the region. In many ways, then, New Zealand's adherence to a non-nuclear security strategy does not seem to have been diminished by the development of AUKUS. On the contrary, Wellington's stance is a good fit with widespread concerns in the Indo-Pacific region about nuclear proliferation. And it also helps to undercut President Xi Jinping's self-serving narrative that China would protect, inverted commas, this vital region from a new Cold War unleashed by the AUKUS states. At the same time, remaining outside AUKUS may have boosted New Zealand's efforts to economically diversify. And this has been identified repeatedly by the Foreign Minister as a key strategic goal, to lessen our economic dependence on China and build up our economic links elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific. Now, if this move by being outside AUKUS has probably helped our efforts to economically diversify, the same cannot be said for Australia. Canberra's participation in AUKUS has complicated its efforts to conclude an FTA with the EU and has done little to help Australia win new markets in the Indo-Pacific. Furthermore, at a time when there are growing signs of a fierce power struggle in Beijing, it's important for New Zealand to maintain some distance from an AUKUS strategy that risked boosting Xi's nationalist credentials in Beijing and angering a number of significant states in the region. New Zealand, of course, has responded to the rise of China by what many people describe as a hedging strategy. But hedging assumes that essentially that the power is concentrated in few hands, and those without the power must accommodate that reality. Is that really true? It's difficult to see how the era of COVID-19 has actually boosted the role of great powers in global politics. Instead of rallying the world against the virus, the United States and China used the crisis to blame each other for a problem that neither could control or resolve. Today's great powers in the 21st century have less autonomy and are more vulnerable than their counterparts of the past. And so it's not surprising in many respects that AUKUS has become an important landmark in the evolution of the contested region of the Indo-Pacific. The possibility of more confrontation in the region or more cooperation will depend a lot on the willingness of the superpowers, that's the United States and China, to acknowledge their own limitations in dealing with an increasing number of problems without borders, whether it be COVID-19, climate change, transnational terrorism, the list goes on. These problems in the 21st century do not recognize borders. And this in turn has given an opportunity to small and middle powers, small powers like New Zealand, to play a role, an active role in shaping international solutions in this most vital region. The question, however, is whether New Zealand and other small states and middle powers will take this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Oh, kia ora. Thanks, Robert. That was just great and segues really nicely, I think, into what Steve Noakes is probably going to share with us as the expert on China. Steve.
Tēnā koutou. I'd like to thank Jennifer and Susan and everybody at the PPI for the invitation to talk, and to everybody listening out there for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Steve, and I'm a political scientist who studies China. I'm mentioning that mostly because while in these remarks I'm going to touch on international relations and economic engagement, and in particular the way geopolitics influences New Zealand's trade relationships and situation in the world, my main message is that there's usually a lot more than meets the eye to the way geopolitics works, the way it operates, and in particular to the way China engages with the outside world, including New Zealand. It's not that there's really anything wrong with the way we usually think about geopolitics in terms of strategic competition, in this instance, bipolar competition among two superpowers. That can be really helpful, can be revealing for thinking about economic opportunities or liabilities. Earlier, we heard the minister state how trade and geopolitical competition are increasingly intertwined, threatening the rules-based order on which New Zealand is very heavily reliant. And this is true, it is, and they are related. Regional competition between superpowers, one in this case established, the United States, and the other emerging still, China, means that countries like New Zealand are going to come under probably increased pressure to, in effect, pick a side with all sorts of potential ramifications, not just for commerce, but for security too, as we've heard. So geopolitics is a perfectly valid kind of perspective to take, but here's my message. It can be ultimately a little bit limiting without a larger sense of what it is that motivates Chinese action on the international stage. And this is why I mentioned my specialization and background. I'm talking about domestic politics in China. China's motivations and the nature of its domestic politics are usually not terribly well understood, at least in this part of the world, but do shape its strategic behavior in huge ways. How? I think it's fair to say that many in New Zealand and around the world have an impression of China as strong and stable and orderly and well institutionalized, a rising power that might rival the United States. And that impression, though not exactly wrong, is not exactly right either. Picture the Pudong skyline, that sparkling, clean, kind of glittering crown jewel of Chinese economic development that makes Ginza seem small time and Manhattan seem passé. The trouble is that's not the real China any more than Manhattan is the real United States. The real China is far more complicated and chaotic and messy and has nowhere near that level of prosperity. It doesn't get said often enough that China is still very much a developing country. And when you understand that, and you understand the political pressures its leaders are under to remedy historic underdevelopment, you gain a kind of new perspective on its behavior in the world. The so-called challenge or threat of a rising China seems a bit less threatening when you realize that China has developing world problems that it's trying to rectify, and that the survival of the world's last major Leninist party state depends very, very heavily on an outward bound economic gambit to keep the economy growing, popular consent for the regime high, and ultimately that regime stable. Obviously, China is a huge deal for New Zealand economically, and is New Zealand's largest trading partner, with two-way trade now exceeding 33 billion, or perhaps a little more now each and every year. Some have talked in recent years about New Zealand's economic dependency on China. There's a debate out there about that. And even more recently, a little more about the need for New Zealand to diversify by seeking reliable trade partners beyond China and not having all the eggs in one basket, so to speak. This makes good sense. But I do want to challenge the way we think about it a little bit. We tend to talk about how Chinese action affects New Zealand, but much less about why it is the way it is. And so we tend to ask questions like, what does an FTA upgrade mean for New Zealanders? Is it good for them? How can New Zealand benefit from the Belt and Road Initiative? What's in it for us? Partly, I think this is quite natural. It's inherent to the structure of politics in a liberal democracy. Politicians understandably want to know how or how much a given course of action will help those they work for. The approach to China is, therefore, I think, understandable and quite well intentioned, but maybe not optimally constructive when trying to unpack Chinese strategic thinking. There's a communication problem, at least to me. It seems like a communication problem. To ask, how can New Zealand cash in on this initiative of the Chinese government, such as Belt and Road? What's the benefit to us? Is to assume it actually is about us, but it's not. Belt and Road and other elements of Chinese grand strategy aren't for the world. They're for China. It's not about New Zealand, and it never was. China may in some measure be doing what it's doing in order to rival the United States, but more than anything, it's the outbound expression of China's own domestic economic development plan. In other words, it's about domestic politics, about the need to achieve middle-class living standards for a country of 1.7 billion in a place that back in the summer of 1960 experienced a famine so severe that measuring by the raw body count of about 34 million still rates to this day as the single worst humanitarian disaster in the history of the world. I'm mentioning this just because I wanted to highlight that there is a connection between these aspects of domestic politics and historic experience and the way China now behaves internationally, including in New Zealand's neighborhood. Domestic politics in China is all about promises and an attempt to meet expectations. Maybe that sounds surprising if you're picturing a strong, stable, authoritarian regime, which China is. But I'm talking now about promises made by a revolutionary socialist movement that took power 75 years ago, when China was one of the world's poorest countries. And it did so specifically to address extreme economic deprivation. Promises about reform and opening and the prosperity that was supposed to bring, and that China has made incredible strides towards, albeit at great human cost, but has not yet fully achieved. Finally, and I think most important, It's about a promise to deliver on popular expectations, lest the Chinese public withdraw its approval for those that govern them and plunge the future of the regime itself into uncertainty. Again, maybe that sounds surprising, but you can't say it'll never happen. And that's because it already has happened. One hot 5 weeks in Beijing 32 years ago, this past June. My point here is simply that thinking about geopolitics, in my view, should really happen ideally with an eye to the sometimes hidden contextual things that can and do shape foreign policy and geostrategy. And we need to work on this a little bit in New Zealand with respect to China. If we appreciated a little more about what makes China tick, we might be in a better position to understand what its actions mean for us, and hence make more sound risk assessments when charting an economic course for New Zealand. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora, Steve. That was great. And I think the emphasis on the domestic is really important because very few of us really understand what's going on in China. And it sort of reflects something that Richard Harman wrote in Politic this morning that was published about and segues nicely to Steve Rituva now about the way in which everybody talks about China growing its influence in the Pacific, but actually the Lowy Institute, they were talking about the figures of investment in the Pacific, and they're not actually growing in terms of financial, which speaks to like what's happening at home and where that funding, I suppose, and investment really needs to go. So Steve, Rituva, welcome. And thank you for persevering with our various technical difficulties today, and I'll hand the floor to you.
Kia ora. Thanks very much, Jennifer. Yes, I managed to survive the technical digital contours, which I, kind of navigated through this morning, and eventually I'm able to do a presentation. So thank you so much, especially after listening to both Robert and Stephen, the expertise in this particular issue. Now, certainly geopolitics and trade and aid, they're all intertwined in very complex ways. It's part of the kind of modern evolution of politics and economics. And certainly in the Pacific, historically since the Cold War and after that, and in the 90s and 2000 and up until now, it becomes even more complex. Not only in terms of how the regional politics has been unfolding, also in terms of the geopolitical contestation within the region and the way in which trade has taken, in some ways, a backseat in terms of overshadowed by the geopolitical contestation, particularly between China and Australia and in the United States. So the Pacific has been, in many ways, considered as being quite marginal in terms of the global power dynamics. When you talk about APEC, for instance, or Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific, the Pacific Ocean itself, the small island states don't feature at all. It features America and Asia. So therefore, the kind of politics which operate within the Pacific, while it may officially be not significant in terms of direct participation within these big, if you like, configurations. The Pacific itself, the Pacific Ocean itself is very, very significant for the big powers. It's always been historically. Now, a number of issues have, in the recent few weeks, can be seen to be very defining in the future when you talk about the geopolitical context of the Pacific in 2022. The first, of course, is COVID. COVID will take a long time in terms of the way in which it plays out, its impact on the economy, the politics, the culture. People are beginning to talk about people leaving the islands as a result of climate change. I'll talk about that later. And certainly is the issue of climate crisis. COP26 has raised the issue of the climate to another level, where the future of the global economy. The private sector, the corporations have pledged trillions of dollars, and much of it is geared towards the zero carbon future in the next few decades. And the market itself, global market, is beginning to respond to that in the way in which corporations are moving in that direction. And certainly here in New Zealand. And of course, out of COP26, also resistance in the form of, the oil corporations. They were represented to the tune of 1 to 11 compared to the Pacific Islands, the small island states. More than 500 delegates from the energy companies were present to do their lobbying. And of course, to some extent, they succeeded in getting countries like Australia and Brazil and India and in Russia and so forth to put a bit of brake in the effort to try and address the issue of climate change. Certainly in the Pacific, the Bold Declaration in 1918 by the Pacific leaders identified the climate crisis as the biggest security threat, human security threat, not only now, but in the future as well. So in terms of trade, a lot of the trade initiatives within the Pacific and with Australia and New Zealand as well, with MFAT, has a very strong climate component to it in relation to the way in which increasingly is seen out of COP26 and out of the leaders' discussions on the climate issue. It has to trickle down not only in relation to aid, but also to trade as well. So we're going to see more of the climate issue beginning to find itself more and more significant, not only in the Pacific, but in the world generally. Now, the Australia in particular is one of the most significant players in the Pacific. Its step-up policy, which was put into place a few years ago, was a means by which it had to respond to the expanding Chinese influence in the region. Chinese influence in the region has been expanding exponentially in the last few decades in terms of aid. Almost every Pacific Island states from east to west, north to south, have Chinese aid in the form of public buildings and public infrastructure, which are very, very visible, although the quality is questionable. But their visibility means that they're able to mobilize people's support in subconscious ways quite well, compared to Australia and New Zealand aid, which is usually invisible, although Australian aid in terms of funding is much higher, but much of the aid goes back to Australia through the contractors. Same thing with New Zealand. And Australia shifted from the step up to the Wuvaile concept, which is what literally means the family. And the family, so the idea is that Australia becomes part of the Pacific family, and issues of trade and issues of aid and response to disaster will have to be framed within the concept of Wuvaile. And then, of course, on top of all this, the Indo-Pacific, the Quad initially, and of course, AUKUS, as Robert had mentioned, Australia, the UK, and the US, which has kind of complicated the geopolitical situation further, and also shifted for a lot of Pacific Island states, that kind of shifted the focus away from issues of trade and other forms of bilateral relationship into security, the securitization of relationship in a significant way. And thus, so this kind of shift from focusing on issues of well-being to security has become an issue as well. And New Zealand's reset policy, which was put into place again some years back, also had shifted a little bit. But in fact, to a significant extent, reset itself had an aspect of response to China's expansion in the region, and the fact that New Zealand, like Australia, felt that they were beginning to lose their influence in the region. So the reset was part of the response to trying to reassert New Zealand's significance in the region a bit more. Now that has changed as well as a result of foreign policy redirection with the new minister from reset to resilience. And resilience is much more not so much focus on state to state, but people to people relationship, the manner of the Pacific and the manner of Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the way in which you can frame discussions, dialogue, and relationship along people to people context. And so Chinese aid itself has been expanding exponentially, like I said earlier, in terms of aid, and trade as well has been growing. They set up a Pacific Trade Center in Shanghai. The number of Pacific Trade Centers all around the region, in Shanghai, in Sydney, in Auckland, and in Tokyo as well, which have been the focal point for trade with the small island states. So trade, certainly in the Pacific, has also always been colored with political and geopolitical aspects, which to be expected, especially when you're dealing with the power imbalance, a lot of power imbalance in terms of the relationship between the small island states in the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, and China. And the small island states in the Pacific have to reconfigure the approach in ways where they can maximize the benefits of trade, the benefits of bilateral relationship. Sometimes bilateral relationships are done on their own, sometimes through the mechanisms of the Pacific Island Forum. The Pacific Island Forum has provision for post-forum dialogue partnership. And that kind of partnership allows for the dialogue with the big powers through trade and so forth to continue. And the European Union, of course, has been around for some time through its Lome Convention, which enables the ACP countries, the Asia Pacific Caribbean countries, to have access to the European Union market. But that, of course, has come under threat as a result of the free trade, WTO rules and all those. And which means that Pacific Island states had to readapt to global trade in very, very tough and very, very challenging ways. And I suppose, just to finish off, I know that I have 1 minute left. The number of challenges in terms of trade and geopolitics in the Pacific in the future. One is that how to address the issue of climate change, and how do you reframe trade in the context of addressing the climate issues, which is significant for the Pacific Island states. And secondly is the power imbalance between the small island states and, of course, Australia and New Zealand, not only economically and politically. And the issue of COVID, how do you the economic systems in the Pacific virtually collapse in some countries, and they're just beginning to rebuild. The rehabilitation is, the post-COVID rehabilitation will go on for ages, for decades. And of course, the issue of geopolitical contestation, now with AUKUS in our doorstep, and Australia being a nuclear power next door, which basically broke the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty signed between the small island states, Australia and New Zealand as well. And all this together become part of the some of the challenges as we move towards 2022. And how do we respond, and how do the countries involved make sure that they maximize the benefits for themselves and minimize on the adversities, which some doomsdayers are talking about already. Thank you very much.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you, Steve. That's great. So I'm conscious that we have about 7 or 8 minutes for questions before Robert has to leave us. So Robert, just in case you have to go before we've kind of completely wrapped up, I might start with you because you did talk about AUKUS and how we might interpret that. And I think, you know, you raised, like, we've still got to kind of wait and see whether or not the implications could be negative. But we would note that Canada also didn't join AUKUS. So we're sort of not the only kind of group or country or economy that's resisted. But my question kind of speaks to more the extent to which Australian domestic politics, and it kind of goes to Steve's Noakes' point about domestic politics influencing the broader geopolitical questions, if you like, is that some of us have been arguing for quite some time now that there's a lot of this is about the way in which the current Australian government the hawks in the bureaucracy and various other think tanks in Australia are kind of trying to make the war on China a domestic political issue in advance of the upcoming federal election. So this and Paul Keating actually has just recently come out and said that he's horrified by the way in which this AUKUS and submarine deal is going to like tie Australia to the US in a way that's interconnected militarily and in other ways that we haven't seen before. And Keating's argument was, we're giving up our independent, or a version of their independent foreign policy position, which New Zealand still hangs on to. Of course, that was contested by the current the government spokespeople. But I just wondered if there was anything that you could elaborate on in terms of how much of what we're seeing coming out of Australia is rhetorical versus substantive, given the relationship with China and the economic dimensions of their own trading relationship in there.
Thanks, Jennifer. Really interesting question. I think one thing that we sometimes lose sight of, because the people-to-people relations with Australia are so important, so many Kiwis living and working in Australia, but the two countries do have quite different worldviews. And this is not new. New Zealand, I think, has a view of the world which is less hierarchical than that of Australia. Australia, like the UK, tends to believe in a globalizing world, and COVID-19, if anything, is accelerating globalization. COVID, in this sort of contemporary environment, the UK and Australia tend to believe their national interests are best served by being close to the United States. And New Zealand, on the other hand, I think takes a view which is more in sync with a worldview of the EU and the Scandinavian countries, which is they want to have very close relations with the United States, but they, if you like, quite pragmatically recognize their interests do not always precisely coincide with the United States. And in a sense, as I tried to indicate in my brief presentation, I think New Zealand's diplomatic position has actually been strengthened in the Indo-Pacific by the advent of AUKUS, because we do want to economically diversify. We do want to look beyond China. At the same time, we don't want to do anything to undermine that very important trade relationship with China. As Steve mentioned, China is our head and shoulders #1 trade partner. And I think the United States is third, but China is definitely #1. So is it just down to domestic politics in Australia? I don't think so. I think Australia for a long time has looked to the United States as a key guide for its foreign policy. This varies a bit, and I noted with interest your comments about Paul Keating. So we may see a debate in the United States, in Australia, as this unfolds. And Scott Morrison seems to be positioning Australia very close to the United States. One thing that really strikes me, and I think Paul Keating and people who agree with him may get momentum, is that Australia's closeness to the United States with regard to AUKUS has complicated Australia's national interests in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. We haven't really spoken about this, but it appears that Australia's attempt to get an FTA with the EU has been severely complicated by what's happened. France is a very important player in the EU, were furious with the development of AUKUS, particularly the way they've been excluded. And I think, for the reasons I mentioned in my presentation, I think Australia, a number of countries such as Indonesia and Malaysia, will see Australia's membership of AUKUS as essentially a country whose first allegiance is to the United States rather than the region. So that may be unfair, but I think perceptions do contribute to reality in politics, even if they're not the same. But I hope that sort of responds to your question.
Steve Noakes, did you want to add anything? And maybe just before you jump in, I wondered, one of the other things that Richard Harmon wrote about, he interviewed a Chinese representative, and they talked about, like, speaking about digital things in trade and the use of different platforms inside China. The response was that they're not going to be keen on allowing Facebook or YouTube and things like that in just yet, because while strategically they're interested, they believe that the BBC and CNN are too dominant to be, and they're not sufficiently present in that digital space yet. So that sort of speaks to a domestic issue that has international dimensions to it, especially for digital trade perhaps, but for other sorts of things. So just wondered if you had any thoughts on that. Sorry, Steve, you're on mute still.
My bad. Yeah, a couple of quick thoughts on that. On the issue of not all platforms being welcome, I think that the key issue with or reluctance to adopt things that are Google based in the Chinese context has, of course, to do with domestic security and surveillance, and it would be just flat out wrong to presume that it doesn't. But also, those are foreign things. And in the last few years, as Chinese foreign policy and grand strategy has acquired a more nationalistic turn, you're seeing a growing tendency to want to develop kind of homegrown alternatives. And so you can see this already in a number of ways. Alibaba is the Chinese version of Amazon. I don't think anybody really uses QQ anymore, but Sina Weibo is the closest thing to Facebook. There are any number of alternative virtual platforms that people use to connect for business and personal reasons all the time. And I think the real thing here is that those are domestically and authentically Chinese platforms and commodities that get the Chinese public away from what its government would call colonial style thinking, the presumption that foreign things must be better simply because they're foreign things. It's not always talked about openly as colonialism in the way that histories are discussed elsewhere in the world, but China's got its own version of that. And there's a real sensitivity to it that you do see in foreign policy. The only other remark I'd make here is that, of course, the broader issue on thinking about domestic politics applies to New Zealand as well. We could, think about this ourselves. It's certainly true that New Zealand does not have any single experience of China, but many. The official version is a valid one, but it's only one. And if I may say, it's a Pākehā one. Māori have their own experiences of China under the PRC, which is separate and distinct and mostly untold. I'd like for that to change, even if I'm not the one to do that retelling. And of course, it varies widely by iwi as well. We have to think about also the present and future of demographic change in New Zealand and realize that there are first generation or second generation immigrants that will have brought with them quite close memories and experiences from mainland China to New Zealand. Some of those will range from the patriotic and the nationalistic to, in some other cases, the truly terrifying personal and shared stories that only asylum seekers tell. So there is a domestic politics of the Chinese experience that happens in Aotearoa too.
Kia ora. Steve Ratuva, you may want to comment on the things that Robert and Steve have mentioned, but I just wanted to pick up on your point about COP26 and the three key things, power and the various power resets, COVID, but climate change, and bringing it back to Australia for a moment. I just wonder, given at COP26, Australia didn't really come out of that of Glasgow looking particularly strong on their own domestic convictions on how to mitigate and how to reduce greenhouse gases and so on, but obviously still want to be an important player in the Pacific. How do you think the Pacific Island states are going to be receiving the Australians' current position on, just how much or little it will do in the climate change area post COP26?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jennifer. Yeah, there's a kind of complex interplay of different factors here. On one hand, Australia is part of the Pacific Island Forum and was part of the declaration, the Bold Declaration, which identified climate crisis as being a significant security factor in the Pacific. And on the other hand, Australia has its own worldview, to put, to use Robert's term, a framing of its own particular interests, which, of course, every country in the world has its own right to do that. And there's a very powerful lobby group in Australia, the mining companies, and of course the Rupert Murdoch media, which is very powerful in terms of the anti-climate lobby. To some extent, they have been shaping the climate position of Australia. And within the Pacific Island Forum itself, the Pacific Island countries are not very, very happy with Australia's stance for being, while very good neighbor, as part of the Wu-Wai concept, the family concept, to be everybody's part of the harmonious relationship within the South Pacific, the Pacific. At the same time, Australia's position has raised a lot of concern and anxiety about the region being able to achieve the aim of achieving the climate targets. Now, at the same time, there's been developments in the geopolitical context, in the way in which the climate issue itself is being geopoliticized, the term which I used in one of my papers. Just before the climate summit, the COP26, I think 1 or 2 weeks before that, China put together a meeting of foreign affairs ministers, in the Pacific. And one of the decisions made was that China was going to fund a China-Pacific climate hub. If you talk about climate and mobilizing climate, is a significant factor for politics in the Pacific. It's something which which China is probably thinking of trying to do here, and of course Australia as well. After COP26, it set aside maybe $104 million for the Indo-Pacific climate carbon climate projects, which enables the Pacific Island states to be able to apply for as well. So at a glance, you're probably going to see a lot of that happening in the future, where the climate issue itself becomes a geopolitical tool of mobilization and contestation, given its significance in the economic and the political arena globally. So for small island states whose focus is largely, it's very much on the climate issue, like in the Pacific. So the big powers will probably be looking at the climate issue as a way of mobilizing their support system.
Kia ora, thank you, Steve. Well, I think lots to jump into there, and I would just, for those of our viewers who end up watching this, once it gets up onto the platform, remind them that we have a full Pacific panel on some of these topics tomorrow. That's on the 9th of December. So you can, join in for that. Hopefully the technical difficulties will be sorted by then. But in the meantime, I really want to thank both Steve Noakes and Steve Ratuva and Maureen Benson-Ray, who had to leave and couldn't stay for the Q&A. And of course, Robert Patman, who's headed back to another meeting at Otago. So from me, Jennifer Curtin here at the University of Auckland, thank you all for joining us, and ka kite anō.